All right, here we go. Well, tēnā koutou katoa. Hello, everybody. Welcome to this afternoon's session, co-hosted by Vic Health and Australia Global Health Alliance. The power of finance and investments for addressing the commercial determinants of health. I'm grateful for the time this afternoon with you all, and I hope you're excited about the discussion as much as I am. For those of you that I haven't had the privilege to meet yet, ko Michelle Murray tōku ingoa. My name is Michelle Murray. So I'd like to begin today's session by acknowledging country, and I'll just make sure I've got this working. Okay. So today we are meeting on the lands of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. For thousands of years, First Peoples has had sustainable economies in the place now called Victoria. These were based on their connection to and care for country, its land, water and resources. The history of Vic Health is grounded in the commercial determinants of health. We are the first health promotion body in the world funded by a tax on tobacco. Fast forwarding to the present, we wanted to give researchers and the public health sector a shared language and evidence to understand and act on commercial determinants of health. We commissioned a Lancet series to shape the consensus and evidence around commercial determinants of health. We then built a new, I'm one behind. No, I'm not, sorry. We then built a new 10-year strategy that articulated this understanding and evidence around commercial determinants of health. Since 1987, Vic Health has evolved our approach from tackling individual behaviours and determinants of health to reshaping systems for a healthier, fairer Victoria. We work across three interconnected systems: neighbourhood and built, commercial and economic, and food systems. As we continue to evolve as an organisation into new and exciting fields, such as the finance and investment sector, health equity is at the core of this work. It now gives me great pleasure to introduce Catherine Howarth, OBE. Catherine Howarth has led Share Action as Chief Executive since 2008. Share Action is a UK-based NGO that works to harness the positive potential of the financial system to support our planet and its people. The organisation promotes ambitious global standards of responsible investment. Of particular relevance to the World Health Summit, Regional Global Standards of Responsible Investment. Meeting Share Action's long-term investors in People's Health Program brings together investors across the world and to hold companies accountable for their impacts on health. I'll now hand over to Catherine. Thank you, Catherine.
Thanks so much, Michelle. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much to Vic Health for what is my first, but I hope maybe not my last visit to Australia. I've been so warmly welcomed from the moment I arrived nearly a week ago. Before I begin, I too, as someone who has travelled a long way to stand here, want to pay my respects to the original owners of these lands, to leaders past, present and emerging of the Aboriginal peoples of this continent. I just want to say that as a visitor, I find it very powerful that you begin your meetings with a mark of respect for Indigenous people. So my task in the next 10 minutes is to share with you some work we've been doing in the UK to act on the commercial determinants of health with the support of major institutional investors like superannuation funds, which we call pension funds in the UK. And as I said, I arrived here 6 days ago, and I've had the opportunity since getting here to meet and speak with a lot of Australian investors, many of your large super funds and asset managers. And my strong sense is that the ground is really well prepared for a significant and impactful effort to drive better health outcomes for people in Australia and potentially right across the Asia-Pacific region, as a result of mobilizing the vast power of Australia's superannuation industry. And so I just think that this is something that you could do here. So let's move into my presentation. I'm going to tell you just a tiny bit about our organization. We define our mission as defining the highest standards for responsible investment and driving change until these are adopted worldwide. So as people will be aware, there are many vast investment organizations all over the world in every continent. They hold incredible power over the companies that shape our health and many other aspects of our lives. Those investors are not doing everything they could today to drive positive outcomes for planet and people. And it's our mission to try and help make that happen. So how we work, we have a toolkit that includes research on investors, but also on companies. We rank the performance of investors when it comes to using their power for positive social and environmental ends. We undertake a lot of public policy advocacy. We work with investors to drive change in the corporate community, and we work with a lot of civil society actors, enabling them to have their voice heard in the corridors of financial power, and in particular, where they have money invested by, let's say, superannuation fund, for them to be heard and for their issues to count. So we also build very long-term good relationships with investors. That's core to our theory of change. We're very relational in the way we operate. We're also independent financially from all of the organizations we challenge, both the corporate community and the investment community. And we work on a bunch of different themes. So health I'm going to talk about today, but we also do a lot of work on climate change, driving companies to decarbonize their operations. We do work on good work, mobilizing investors to push companies to treat their workforce well, and also on biodiversity, tackling things like the problems arising from overuse of pesticides. So long-term investors in people's health, or LIFE, is an initiative that we developed about 5 years ago to acknowledge that companies, and therefore investors, have an outsized influence on people's health. But health has actually been a neglected theme within the field of responsible investment. You will probably be really familiar with the statistics that up to 80% of health outcomes are driven by environmental factors, like when you walk into a supermarket, what is the price, promotions, the product placement. These are things that are driving people's health. So long-term investors in people's health was created to tackle the corporate determinants of health. And it started with a pilot focused on our retailers, major supermarket retailers in the UK. We wanted to drive sales of healthier food options and improve corporate disclosure on health impact. But it's just worth saying that LIFE, which is quite a young initiative, and so far relatively European-centric and even UK-centric, but with great ambitions to be connecting with partners all over the world, especially here in Australia and in the Asia-Pacific region. We're doing work now on kind of consumer health, workforce health, and community or environmental health, all of which are themes where companies really shape outcomes. We're taking quite a holistic approach, so we bring the risks and impacts related to corporate determinants of health to the attention of investors who are quite undereducated on this topic. We support investors to incorporate that knowledge into their work, especially by having a dialogue with companies to change course and be more health-focused. And we also advocate for regulatory change to require health-focused corporate disclosure and raise standards of investor practice in this area. So why should investors care about health? I mean, let's face it, investors are sort of money-focused, returns-focused entities, but there are lots of reasons why a money-focused, returns-focused entity might consider health and think about its implications for them. Because companies are increasingly subject to regulatory action For example, sugar taxes is a good example. Reputational risk, companies that are seen to be not caring enough about people's health can bear reputational risk and consumers can turn away from them. There are legal risks. There are sort of systems-wide risks where one company's impact on health actually costs other companies a price which reduces their profits. So we think that if you're an investor that holds lots of different companies in your portfolio, you would actually take an interest in companies that have a detrimental impact because it could actually improve the returns of other companies in your portfolio. And then there's market risks. So where consumers are making different choices, for example, more healthy choices, it's good to be on the right side of that trend. So there's lots of quite financially focused reasons, as well as just caring about people's health, that investors might pay attention. And that's allowed us, making that case has allowed us to bring together so far 44 investors from 8 different countries, including, I'm happy to say, our first Australian investor, Ethical Partners, and a big shout out to them. The Life Coalition has, between them, $5 trillion of US dollars in assets under management. Sorry about all these acronyms on the stage. And here are some of the names of some of the investors involved, which, of course, we'd love to be able to put up a slide in a few years' time with a whole load of Australian investor names. But so the approach we've adopted is working, and I just wanted to pick out some of these numbers. So when we started tackling the UK supermarket sector, the retailers, in 2009, just 2 of them were reporting on the percentage of sales that were healthy. And that's gone to 6 following dialogue and pressure from investors. More importantly, there were no companies in the UK retail sector that had set a long-term sales-based target to improve the share of healthy food sold. And that's now 5 companies. And these are the major retailers in our economy. So 5 is a good share of the overall market. In fact, it's a majority. And then we've gone to 10 who are reporting against a government-endorsed nutrient profile model. And actually, Health Star Rating, which is an Australian system, is quite a popular one. So I don't want to overclaim, but I think what we've shown, and it's early days for Life, is that bringing investors together to have a focused dialogue that's really evidence-based can drive real change in an industry like the retail sector. And there was a fantastic presentation earlier in the session on preventing childhood obesity, just showing how important the retail sector is in shaping our life choices and our diets. So we're moving from this theme to air quality and worker health campaign, but there's far more to be done on nutrition, and we'll keep it going. Indeed, we have so far had good impacts on Tesco is our largest supermarket. Sainsbury's is our second largest. Both of them have made significant commitments since we started this work. I should say with Tesco, we had to really dial up the pressure. We filed a shareholder proposal, which meant that all the global investors in Tesco had to vote on whether they wanted Tesco to make a commitment on health, and that really put the issue on the agenda of the board of directors. So sometimes, this stuff can feel a little bit spiky, but necessarily so. And I thought I'd just close in mentioning Nestlé, the world's largest food manufacturer. We've pivoted from retail into engaging with the food manufacturing sector. Nestlé, as people might be aware, was exposed about 10 days ago for adding sugar into baby milk powder in a number of developing world countries. So not a company that we can really trust with our health. I understand that 70% of their sales in Australia are of things that are deemed unhealthy against the Health Star Rating. And we have been really putting the pressure on our friends at Nestlé. We got Legal & General, which is the UK's largest asset manager, to file a proposal which went to a vote last week. We got 11% of the vote share, so that's 89% of investors were a bit cautious, but 11% came with us, which we think is a good foot in the door and definitely creates space for a dialogue in the coming months with Nestlé about where they're heading on this agenda. And we would really welcome participation of Australian investors because Nestlé is a company that really counts here. Australian investors are quite exposed to Nestlé as a share, and there's a real opportunity. So I hope in my little presentation here, I've given you a sense of both what's possible, how important it is to collaborate, and an invitation to do more together.
Thank you, Catherine. I, for one, have lots of food for thought, if I can use that term, following your presentation. Hello, everyone. I'm Bonnie. I'm the manager of the Commercial Determinants of Health team at Vic Health, and really excited to have you all in the room. We want to make sure that you get as much as you can out of this session, and so you can all help us do that by letting us know who you are. We want to know what areas of work you're in, and that can mean that we can tailor this next part of the session to you. So if I can ask you to, and I'll just move one slide over, get out your devices and please scan the QR code that's up on the screen. And there's a code there too, you can pop in if you need. Okay. Most of you have got it, okay. Oh, okay, I think I moved forward. Okay, so now we're jumping into the questions, and I will just ask my team, do I need to see them up on the screen, or is that okay? I think we're just waiting. Okay, I can already see some answers in front of me. This is magic. So the first question is, what field do you work in? And, here we go, now I'm seeing it. Public health is the big one. I'm not surprised. Health promotion, global health, research. What I'm interested to see is if we have any people in the private sector or focused on economics. I can see economics is popping up. I saw pharmaceuticals come up at one point, so that's really interesting. And we've got a real mix from medical backgrounds, universities, non-government organisations. I'm not sure if this is going to help the panel narrow down at all. Okay, let's go to the next question, please. Okay, this one is, how would you rate your confidence in understanding the relationship between the finance and investment sector and health? So on a 1 being you're not really sure, 5 being you've nailed it and you probably can walk out of the room. This is when all the panel leaves, as you've all got it. Okay, so most of you are saying, look, I know a bit, but maybe you could learn more. Okay, that's good. We've got 15 or so % that really don't know much at all too. So again, not sure how helpful this is, but it looks like we don't have any many in the audience who are super confident here. So I think that means we're all going to be listening closely to our panel for your advice. Okay, next question, please. Okay, so what is one benefit of working with commercial actors? So this is a bit of a qualitative question. You can go wild here. It could be one word, could be a few. Money, yes. We've certainly been hearing about tight government purse strings across Australia and the Western Pacific region. So money, funding are coming up. But also impact, I think that's a really good one and touches, I think, Catherine, on a lot of your discussion. Power, systemic change, technical innovation. Okay, looks like people see that there are quite a lot of benefits. Okay, so let's go to the next question. Thank you. Which is, what is one risk of working with commercial actors? And I think those in the public health sector, we've all probably got a fair degree of caution with working with particularly harmful industries like alcohol, tobacco, gambling. I think a lot of us are probably quite comfortable knowing where our limits of engagement are, but what about more broadly, other commercial actors? Okay, conflict of interest, very strong. Vested interests, self-interests, a lot of that is coming up. Reputational risk, values alignment, greenwashing. I think these are all, it looks like a lot of us have seen through some of the corporate tactics of corporate social responsibility. Okay, industry capture. Thank you. All right, do we have one more question, or is that the last of the questions? Here we go. What is the role of health promoting organisations in influencing commercial actors? So this is really a question for you all. What do you think your organisation might be able to do in this space? Okay, we've got accountability is a strong theme, and advocacy. Finding shared outcomes, action through research, helping understand the risks and the benefits, regulation and policy. Okay, so accountability and regulation and advocacy seem really strong themes coming up here. And research as well. Okay, well, it seems like a lot of us think there is a role to play. So what we're going to do now is drill down in that a little bit further and hopefully give you all some really practical advice and inspiration for what you might be able to take away from this session. So I might close that there. And I'd love to welcome Katerina Georgi to the stage. Katerina is the CEO of the Foundation for Alcohol Research and Education. FARE does some really incredible work in the alcohol harm prevention space and is a really long-term and good friend of Vic Health. So welcome, Katerina. Thank you.
Hi. That's me, Kat. I'm the friend of Vic Health, who is also part of the wonderful team at the Foundation for Alcohol Research and Education. I just want to start by saying that I feel extremely fortunate to be chairing this panel today. And it's a panel of absolutely wonderful humans. I just want to start by telling you a little bit about FARE, or the Foundation for Alcohol Research and Education. So FARE is working towards an Australia free from alcohol harms, and we do that in 4 different ways. So we build the capacity of people with lived experience to drive change, we raise community awareness, we drive policy change, and one of the things that's most relevant to this panel is we aim to increase industry accountability. So in Australia, 36% of alcohol is sold to 5% of people, and this makes alcohol companies that trade in addiction. Their business model is to drive sales among people who they call their super consumers or best customers. They're people who drink at the highest levels. And in a digital world, alcohol companies have more data on these people than ever before and are able to track, trace and target these people in ways that were never possible. And this makes it really impossible for people who are doing it tough to escape. So these companies also actively place alcohol stores in areas where we have the highest level of alcohol harm and areas that are lower socioeconomic status. So just 3 years ago, FAIR worked with Arnie Helen and the community of Bagot, a community who has chosen to be dry or alcohol-free, to stop one of the biggest supermarkets in the country, Woolworths, from building one of the biggest alcohol stores in the country within walking distance of Arnie Helen's community. We didn't do this with the help of the regulatory environment or government. In fact, the Northern Territory government, in all of their wisdom, changed the law 3 times to make this store more possible. We did this by using corporate campaigning and shareholder action. So the commercial determinants of health and how we use the power of finance and investments to advance health is of significant interest to me and the team at FAIR. And it's because we need to use every tool in our toolbox to help to create change. And for organisations that have traditionally worked in a public health context, this isn't our default position or approach. And we've seen that from some of the responses of the survey here today. So it's meant learning to flex a new muscle. The approach we take to creating change is to be crystal clear on what we're trying to achieve, to understand where the power lies, and then to work out how we shift that power to achieve the outcome we're seeking. And we do that a lot in government context, but not so much in the corporate world. And while there are many stories of governments achieving positive health outcomes, there are also many examples of governments failing to act to progress health. And I just want to stop and pause on that, because anyone who's been to any session over the last couple of days has to have heard that governments need to be doing better, that there are many indicators that are heading in the wrong direction. And so we need other ways to progress prevention of non-communicable diseases. And that includes targeting the significant vested interests that exist, the companies that profit significantly from addiction and mass ill health, and work to actively undermine our good health policy. So when governments fail to act, we need to directly put pressure on companies to shift. And it's an approach that involves a lot more grey than we might be used to, and where we sometimes as a sector set really hard rules about engagement. We're very black and white about the way that we engage. And it's understandable on why we've done this, because this is about trust. And how can you trust the people who add sugar to baby formula? I have some words to say about them, but not on a stage. I should be clear, I'm not asking you to trust the boards and CEOs of these companies. I'm asking you to consider what it looks like to enter their world, to go into their boardrooms, their shareholder meetings, to have a look at their laws, the corporation's laws, to go into courtrooms to challenge the way that they're working and hold them accountable for the harms that they are driving. So this panel is all about the grey, and by that I don't mean that the panel is older, because we have a very young, fabulous-looking panel. I mean that it's in a space where we might be uncomfortable, where things are a bit murky. And I want to challenge you to lean into the grey and to lean into strategy, lean into campaigning, to think of how we can create change if we use every single tool in our toolbox. So we thought we'd mix it up with the introductions here today, and when we introduce ourselves, we're going to share who we are and how we work to create change through leveraging the power of finance and health. So we've heard from Catherine with her wonderful keynote address, but we will start with you, Catherine. I'd love to hear about you, and just in a sentence or two, how would you describe how Share Action UK drives change?
Well, it's all about... Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yeah.
It's all about power. It's about mixing people power with financial power, and that is a very potent blend. But we need potent strategies to address the enormous challenges that we're facing. Health being prominent today, but when we think about, the climate crisis, the biodiversity crisis, they're all interlocking, and they're all driven to a greater or lesser extent by corporate power, and we need to match that and make companies be their best selves.
Excellent. Ella Robinson is a Senior Impact and Ethics Analyst at Australian Ethical. Ella, tell us a bit about how you drive change.
So I am based at Australian Ethical Investment. For those of you who don't know, we are an ethical fund manager and superannuation fund. Our purpose is to invest for a better world for people, planet and animals. And we have an ethical charter that guides our decision making around that. And we try to influence change through various different avenues. So one big one is obviously capital allocation. So deciding where our money is invested in and putting it towards companies that we see as supporting a better world and not supporting companies that are creating those negative impacts. So in the health space, for example, we wouldn't invest in alcohol, gambling, junk food companies, but we might invest in healthcare companies, fruit and vegetable growers, and things like education. Another area that we try to create change in is through advocacy and engagement. So that can be through the companies that we invest in, and it can also be through sort of driving more kind of systemic change. So we do that through engaging one-on-one with companies and through investor coalitions. We do it through voting, as Catherine mentioned, and shareholder resolutions, and also through sort of policy advocacy and public campaigns. So trying to push governments to introduce stronger policies and create more public awareness around sort of those issues that we are interested in.
Excellent. Thanks, Ella. We're now going to go to Mr. Tay Chun Hong, who is the Chief Executive of the Health Promotion Board in Singapore. Welcome, Tay.
Thanks for the welcome. My name is Chun Hong from Singapore Health Promotion Board. So it is kind of my counterpart is Vic Health, right? So if I describe it that way, you kind of know where we're from. So I'm a government agency that's trying very hard not to fail and trying very hard to act fast. On this topic, our approach is really how do we shape the whole ecosystem. And looking at, for example, using the example of food, is how do we shape both the upstream supply as well as the consumer demand aspect of it, so that the environment shifts as a whole, such that when consumers go into retail, F&B and so on, healthier choices become the default. But apart from education and so on, we do need the industry to play their part. So what we do is we have voluntary standards as well as certain regulations that we have just introduced recently. And through that, plus working with the industry on reformulation to persuade them to move towards offering a greater diversity of healthier food options. So it's been a very long journey, happy to share more later. But I think a large part of it is how do we get all parties within the country, within the ecosystem, to understand the national imperative around health, using data, using evidence, and then just trying to find ways to work with one another. Right. At the start, it might be a bit awkward, kind of like interests don't align. But I think over time, you start to discover that there are certain things that we can each do and contribute to the picture, and then let that build over time so that the ecosystem starts to shift.
Excellent. I'm excited to unpack that awkward part a little bit more as we go on, Tay. And Dr. Adnan A. Haider is the Senior Associate Dean for Research and Innovation and Professor of Global Health at George Washington University. Adnan, can you tell us a little bit about how you drive change in this space?
First of all, good afternoon. Thank you very much for having me on the panel, and my respect to the owners of the land. If you wouldn't mind, I'm going to say a few words of context here, which I think is incredibly important, because I come from the field of public health, and public health assumed good intent by all sectors for the promotion of health for a long time. And then suddenly we lost our innocence when we realized that the tobacco industry was lying to us. And that all the studies that we were claiming that there was no impact on health were actually untrue and were tainted. It took us 45 years, by the way, to learn that lesson. So now we want to be smarter and a little bit more careful. And I think that historical context is really important, because Nestle in 1960s claimed that powder milk is better for mothers than breast milk. And that's why the US representative in 1969 to the United Nations walked out and had to resign, because his government was supporting powder milk. And he knew, as a Columbia School of Public Health ex-professor, that breast milk is better for moms. right? So this conflict is historical. It's now, as of 2016 and 17, when the first papers came out, driving the commercial determinants of health phraseology. But it comes back to us again and again. And as academics, our power lies in either data or education. I won't talk about education much, but certainly data. Because data is brilliant. When you have it, you can use it in multiple ways. You can use it strategically to convince partners, which my colleague from Singapore is doing, but you can also use it to naming and shaming people. And you may be ranking investors because you don't want to be in a lower rank. You want to climb higher in those rankings. So these are some of the strategies that we can build on our evidence and our data, and certainly partner with colleagues like this to enhance our power across the field.
Excellent. Thank you for that historical context. I'm actually going to start with you now. You've done this to yourself, Adnan. And the question I want to ask you is that context is really interesting in that trust around tobacco companies, because if we had to make an assessment now, I'd say that we're in the complete other direction of not trusting any company for any reason at any point in time. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
You know, trust isn't a right. It has to be earned. And that's true of what we've seen in public health during COVID. In an earlier session, we talked about how public health lost some of that trust. Now you have to earn it back. So 20 years ago, when I started work in the field of road safety, and I'm going to use two quick examples to demonstrate my point, we looked at how safe roads are that are being built in low and middle income countries. And the largest builder of those roads is the World Bank through their transport and development funds. Actually, the World Bank didn't have road safety as a feature of those roads. It was all engineers constructing good civil engineering. So they hired 20 years ago, based on the pressure and conversations between the WHO at that time that we were working with and the World Bank, the first road safety advisor, to begin to think about constructing roads that are efficient and will transport goods, but will also not kill people, right? Similarly, within the field, my field of road safety, if you haven't figured out, are car manufacturers. The same industry, the same company producing cars for Sweden, 5-star. For Ghana, 1-star. Because they buy it. And how do you get this same industry to change that? And so you start the National Car Assessment Program, and you make it a global National Car Assessment Program, and you start rating that, and you have press releases that the Renault in Ghana is 2-star. The Renault in France is 5-star. Why is this different there? And then once again, this process. So I'm just demonstrating a strategy or two. So I don't believe that they have the right to be trusted. I think they have to earn their trust, and that remains my current position. Thank you.
It's fantastic. Lots of agreement here around that. I want to actually go to Catherine, because that context around ranking and scorecards, that's a tool that you use at ShareAction UK, and I was hoping that you could share a little bit more about that, how that works, an example of you using that in the current environment.
Yes, so actually just last week we published a ranking of the world's largest insurance companies, assessing them on their sustainable and responsible investment, and it creates tremendously useful competition. People do like to be at the top of rankings. These rankings are read by people that serve on the boards of companies. And they also tend to, many reasons we find them helpful is that typically a lot of different stakeholders will look at that material. So it gets coverage. Rankings are journalistically friendly. They're also, we make the methodology totally transparent. It's very important as a researcher to be trustworthy too. So that's a key piece of this. But one of the things we find is that I think it's very important not to demonize either companies or investors. They have a role to play. They have a function in society, really important functions. But typically, there are people that work inside them who are super committed to the sustainability agenda. And when someone else, a third-party organization that's trustworthy, ranks their company against other people, it often empowers people inside those firms that are trying to make the case for change and investment in these themes and so on. So for multiple reasons, we found rankings to be an incredibly useful part of the toolkit. And we've been doing them for years, and they're like the gift that keep on giving, to be honest. And you ratchet up the methodology. In the early years, we were just evaluating people on how transparent they were, because we couldn't get much information at all. Now we're deep into evaluating and ranking people on their substantive impact. So there's lots of scope to evolve these rankings, but also to compare over time on certain metrics. So really powerful tool, and you can apply them at a global level, a local level, a national level, really flexible too.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And that sort of approach to nudge people, I think the point you're making around the fact that these companies are made up of people, which sounds like a really obvious point, and there are people within it who are wanting to see that change and drive that change. That leads me to a question to you, Tay, and you're in a different situation where you're working within a public health agency. And so one of the things you were talking about was leaning on companies around reformulation. How do you tread that line of working with them, of working through the trust, of pushing them to drive that change, of finding the good people? Can you talk to us about that awkward phase?
Yeah, so when we first talk to industry and so on, I think we have to be very clear what the problem definition is, and to be able to reach a state where it is something that the industry can take a first step on, right? Because sometimes it's like last week I talked to instant noodle manufacturers, and I talked to them about the need to reduce sodium. And you can guess how some of them responded, right? Ramen with no sodium or low sodium will be bland and tasteless, and where's the salt hit?
Those products are just sodium, right?
It's largely sodium. And therefore, at the start, there's always this, how far are you going to go as a government agency? And then for the industry, they are also very mindful that government can always use a policy lever, but we don't necessarily want to use it in the first instance. We always go with the voluntary effort. But the conversation, then we need to land on something that is quite concrete and tangible, right? Which is there some first step that we can take on sodium reduction, right? And potentially using things like potassium salt and so on. And then, of course, from our end, we do provide some grants for industry reformulation, because they may need to undertake some expenditures on R&D. And that was just the first conversation, and then we need to give them some time, check in with them, how is it working, has there been other alternatives, and we also bring the industry together to kind of share what might be some of the practices that they're looking at. And I think that, in a way, helps everybody constantly come together on the same objective, right, for a particular well-defined issue, right? In this case, it's sodium. We did the same for sugar many years ago, right? And today, I think sugar in Singapore, the diabetes prevalence has stabilized. And if you go to Singapore, you might find that our soda drinks taste weird. But that's because 3/4 of the SKUs in retail shelves are healthier choice drinks. 3/4. We didn't start at 3/4. We started much lower. So it's the same approach, working with industry, talking through what is that nutrient of concern, what might be the first step that we can do. Over time, the industry responded by producing some pilot things, and we then supported that through public education, through our campaigns, encouraging people to purchase the healthier choice ingredients and drinks in that instance. And it was kind of like the back and forth, right? On the consumer end, you need to help them readjust the taste buds, right? Otherwise, nobody's going to buy our weird tasting drinks. But on the industry end, then is seeing that consumers are responding to the healthier choice, and then they are now more willing to increase the number of SKUs, right, of the healthier choice products. We only did regulation a couple of years back, where we introduced a Nutri-Grade label. Right, so the healthier choice label was a positive voluntary label. So if you voluntarily meet the the standards of sugar and so on, you can apply and you can put the triangle on. It's very well recognized today. We introduced Nutri-Grade as the negative label. So if your sugar level remains too high, you must put a grade C or a grade D, right? And the grade D drink, you are banned from advertising. So it was a long journey with them. By the time we wanted to introduce the regulatory label, the industry was already prepared for that. So we didn't get very much negative feedback. In fact, they knew it was coming, and that's why we could achieve 3/4 of the SKUs being healthier choice. We did succeed with milk though, because milk is higher in saturated fat, so most of the milk is grade C, right? And we are getting some feedback from the milk industry. So that awkwardness again, are you vilifying milk? And then we are saying that no, for certain groups of the population, like the young, right, and the older adults, it's actually okay for them. But everybody else should try to go for reduced fat or skim milk, right, in that sense. So back to the question is about having a very clear problem statement to work together with, and then exploring possibilities, first few steps that we can take together. From the government end, recognizing that the ecosystem is not just the industry making the switch, but consumers also needing to switch their choices and so on, and then using that as a reinforcing loop, right, to get both sides to work together. So we did it for sugar quite well. For sodium, it's a whole different matter. We are trying very hard to see how we can work that same approach, but if you know the Singapore cuisine, right, it's not so much processed food. It's actually hawker food and so on, where it sources salt and seasoning, where a labeling approach may not actually work so well. So we are trying hard to figure out what might be a same approach for sodium that's different from sugar. And yeah, we're now taking the action of that.
Thanks, Tay. That clarity around the problem and that clarity around what's in or out, that kind of leads me to you, Ella, because one of the things that you do is you guys name companies as ethical or not. And that in itself, I imagine, would be quite the minefield. Can you talk to us a little bit about how you define that, how you determine what's in or out, how that works in your organisation?
Yeah, sure. Great question. And it can sometimes be really difficult. So I mentioned we have an ethical charter which lays out sort of 23 principles for the types of companies that we invest in, so positive and negative principles. So companies have to be aligned with one of the positive principles before we can invest in them. So that lays out what we call our ethical universe of companies. So it's obviously a much smaller pool of companies than what your kind of standard fund would be investing in. Mm-hmm. And then we've developed frameworks to assess particular companies and sectors against those principles. So we have different frameworks depending on the type of company and also depending on the type of issue. So, for example, we have a food framework that we use to assess food companies against, and that would consider things like, does the food being produced contribute to a healthy diet? Is the company managing environmental sustainability impacts, and are they taking into account animal welfare concerns? And then we would also have frameworks that we'd use to assess particular issues. So human rights, for example, we might have a framework to assess companies against human rights, and that would apply to all different companies that are exposed to human rights risks. So a food company might be assessed according to the food framework, and they might also be assessed according to the human rights framework. So I guess sometimes there's companies that are clearly in or out, and those sort of exclusions are very easy to make. Things like alcohol, tobacco, it's kind of a clear out for our universe. But then other companies, like as I mentioned, food companies, they can be a lot more sort of weighing up the good and the bad, I guess. It's a kind of balancing act, but we've tried to put in as much kind of detail as we can into the frameworks that we've developed to assess companies.
Yeah. And I guess that to all of the points and all of the examples, none of these activities involve no risk. And I want to come to that. This kind of unpacks the notion of trust, that notion of risk. To you, Adnan, it's how do we assess the risks and then determine, the extent to which we can be confident of the different recommendations we're making or the different policies we're pursuing or the different categorisation that we're giving to various companies or policies or activities?
It's a tough question. But risk assessment ought to be done at multiple levels. I think it's very important to remember that the first risk is to those who are engaging in those discussions. So reflexivity is really important, whether you're an academic or an independent agency or a government official. When you go into those discussions with the industry, you have to understand that there is a risk inherently just in that engagement from multiple perspectives. Second, of course, there is a risk of what is the ultimate outcome that you want, and very nicely explained by Tay, and how long will it take to get there? Because if it's going to take you eternity for this micro movement, then it's not worthwhile. At the same time, too fast a movement might yield a backlash, which is also ultimately not beneficial. So there are levels. But there are also different types of risks, right? So there is the reputational risk, which I talked about earlier. There's the investment risk, the financial risk that may happen. But there's also, and because we are in public health, there is a public health risk element involved here as well. It's about those other things that maybe you assess in your framework, which is about respect for persons, respect for autonomy, respect for decision-making by individuals and communities. And the industry is very smart. In many instances, they will say you should treat us like persons and give us all the rights of a personhood, because persons are treated very differently in law and in regulations compared to organizations. And this is one of the strategies we teach in our courses about commercial power, is they want to be treated like persons in certain sectors, and in other sectors they want to be industries and rule themselves. So it's a very slippery slope. And I'll make my final point to stimulate Tay, which is, if you interfere in their business, they're not going to be polite or micromanaging. They'll come after you. If they feel that you're taking 10% of their profit, watch what they do to you or your industry or school or whatever it is. Why are we so kind and polite in confronting the industry? I know your answer as a government official, but I worry. Why do I need gloves to deal with industry? I want to go with my data and say this is the idea.
Which gloves? Boxing gloves? Or?
But just to stimulate the discussion a little bit, I'd like to hear more responses on the nature of those discussions. Thank you.
Yeah,
That should answer your question.
No, that you answered the question fantastically, and it is a good segue to Tay. I think, Tay, around risks, what you're describing isn't what we would normally hear a public health agency doing. So inevitably there would be some criticism, some scepticism around the types of approaches you're doing and risk to your reputation. And one of those is this question around why work with them like this? Why would we trust them? Why would we sit down with them? Why would we go through this approach? So how do you manage this?
Yeah, I think first of all, we recognize that working with industry is a non-starter. We have to, right? Because as the earlier presentation, 80% of the health determinants is coming from that. And food, for example, is a huge factor. So the question then is how, right? What is the approach to work with the industry? I think at least in Singapore, it's not a secret. I think industry always knows that if we decide on a certain regulation, we will see through it. Then the question is, do we go regulation first, or do we do the reformulation and all these things first? Give it a try. So that was the approach that we used. So we do voluntary reformulation, knowing full well that reputational risk is on the line. But that's where the evidence, right, needs to be very clear and very strong. For example, sugar sweetened beverages. A lot of the reformulation is using non-nutritive sweeteners, which WHO had a certain statement about. And thankfully, our framework is such that you can never get an A grade if you use a sweetener, right? So then there is some distinction there. And we do need to protect ourselves in terms of how we set the standards and the thresholds. For sodium, we have been promoting potassium salt, and there has been some questions around the safety. Right, and that's where the health risk, right, of some of these things need to come in. So we need to be extremely thorough in our research, in our evidence base, such that when we focus on a certain nutrition of concern, we sort of have already covered our bases. And then for the industry, when they move and they don't move and so on, we kind of are very clear about where the lines are, right, so that we protect ourselves. There were questions about why do we work with McDonald's. So McDonald's do offer some healthier choice options within their menus. They tend to be salads, corn cups, and some healthier drinks as well. But you see, our philosophy is then we're not saying that consumers cannot have their indulgence once in a while, but it is more of are you exercising consumer choice, right? And how do I help you exercise that choice, right? Look for the triangle symbol. Right, that's the easiest way of doing so. So that companies, they can still produce their full sugar, Coca-Cola, and stuff like that. But we are also hoping that the consumers will exercise their choice and the industry will respond accordingly. Right, so it's multifaceted. I fully agree with what you said. Many different areas of risk. We don't go in with very rose-tinted glasses. We know that they have their own business concerns and considerations. And that's why actually at this panel, I was quite happy to hear how you are spurring the conversations within the boardroom and at the corporate level, which is not something that we get to see. Yeah, and that's something that I thought is actually quite a good complement, right, to our approaches.
Catherine.
I just wanted to turn it on its head a tiny bit. So there's no doubt that this kind of work presents risks for organisations in the public health field. Risks of being, tainted by association or whatever. But I just want to turn around and say there is such a huge risk if we don't get to work on this agenda. Companies are shaping people's health every day in so many ways, and we just can't afford to be missing in action on this. So I think that's the bigger risk. But having said that, in the way we go about this, it's incredibly important to have safeguards. And the number one, I guess, for us at Share Action is take no money from this industry, any commercial actors or investment organizations. And then, just be really grounded in your values, which for us are courage, persistence, and independence. Those are our three values. And I think if you're guided by that, that's been really helpful to us.
Excellent. Ella, did you want to add something around this as well?
I guess I would just add on the risk point, and probably risk from a different angle, but I guess investors, as Catherine has already spoken about, they really care about financial risk. And one of the biggest drivers of financial risk is regulation. So pushing for mandatory regulation is something that investors are going to pay attention to, and we'll get them to act on this issue. Similarly, putting your gloves on and agitating, advocating, getting things out in the media, pushing consumers to push their investors to care about this is all things that's going to kind of help shift the dial as well. So, that would be all I would say.
So let's go to this point then. I don't know if we're putting our boxing gloves on or taking our delicate gloves off and throwing them on the ground, but when it goes to the fight, Catherine, I want you to unpack for us, the times when we need to hold those companies really accountable in a way that is more combative. How does that play out?
So, one of the more so you start, typically, our work anyway, starts with quite a friendly dialogue. And after all, the reason we work with investors in companies is that investors own companies. And so they're actually committed to companies' success. They're kind of on the side of companies. And at the same time, they're very cognizant of risk. And for example, superannuation funds or pension funds invest on behalf of people whose lives are affected by what companies get up to. So there is a very strong rationale for engaging in a dialogue with companies. And investors have very strong powers, which go back to the formation of large corporate entities in the mid-19th century. People that put capital, money to work in companies wanted to have protections in the form of rights, for example, to elect people that sit on the boards of those companies to act on their interests. So there's all this shareholder rights that can be activated in a way that focuses the minds of directors. So, if you think your shareholders are going to vote against your election as a director, well, you will engage in a dialogue you will listen to the issues that they're trying to bring forward. So there are some quite sort of powerful tools in this toolkit. but investors are often quite reluctant to use them. And so part of the role of an organisation like mine is to encourage the deployment of these tools and tactics by large institutional investors who sort of almost prefer to sit on the sidelines, not get too agitational or confrontational. So it's a really kind of weird and interesting type of campaigning where you're working with actors that have all this power that they almost prefer not to use, and reminding them on whose behalf they ultimately act. And I think, one of the reasons we're so interested in advocacy from ordinary organizations that recognize the power of their voice within the financial system is that it actually ends up holding investors accountable to their real stakeholders in the community and the members of, for example, the pension schemes, to push them to think in this more long-term, enlightened and people-centric way. But it's a cultural challenge. That's not the way investors are trained when they go to kind of they've learnt their craft as investors. It's not typically focused on this. But I do think this whole agenda of ESG is it's really rising up. It's such a transformation from even 15 years ago. And that's because people, as soon as they understand the power held in their pension schemes and superannuation funds and so on, are mostly, surveys show, extremely interested in their pension funds using that power in a way that's positive for society, environment and health. So we're on a journey. It's early days. We don't want to scare the horses too much with these kind of combative tactics, but they are there and can be used. And when they're used, it really does change corporate behaviour.
I think this is... it's a really interesting point around the fight, because there's a fairly famous video in Australia now of the CEO of Woolworths having a moment and walking out of an interview because he's questioned in a particular way. And to Adnan's point, I don't think that, we ask those questions. And I often find myself sitting in these meetings going, what would BHP do? They wouldn't back down at this point. They wouldn't be walking out. And I'm surprised at how fewer questions you need to ask before they start to lose their cool, because they're not interrogated often. So Adnan, can you talk a little bit more about when you were saying before around, why are we backing down? Why aren't we standing more? Can you talk to us a bit more about that and unpack that a bit more for us?
Yeah. Well, in public health, we are good people. So we fundamentally want to start with a conversation. But I think there are important reasons why these are truly difficult conversations. First is that we all exist within a society where, as both of you have indicated, these things are already happening. And there you are trying to create a change in the way people are used to, this is how things are done. A former chief executive of a beverage company in the US several years ago said, obesity is not because of the calories of my drinks, but because of those other calories that these people have. And she became famous after that. She stepped down later on. But it's like that was the response to the obesity question when she was polled. I think the disbelief that rational people cannot see the same problem at the same time sometimes makes us not confront those situations. Number two, lack of data, lack of evidence. It has taken us years to get all of the information together. Tay has repeatedly said, twice or thrice he has said, I needed my research, I needed my evidence, I needed my data. And that requires time. And it's just taken us a decade for public health to get ourselves around the commercial determinants of health concept. Number three, our universities, our governments are already infiltrated by that money. Your principal are not accepting money. So again, in the road safety field, I want to give you a couple of examples. Vietnam was about to pass a wonderful law on alcohol and drink driving. One of the best laws, in our opinion, a few years ago. We worked very hard, the global community, for 3 or 4 years. Somehow, it slowed down through one house, then it got changed through the second house, and by the time it passed, it was the most diluted drink driving law that you've ever seen. And there was, incidentally, the Diageos and the Heinekens and so on all over Vietnam.
I know them well.
Yeah. And so the powers that we are confronted with are effective. They know how to work things. And we are still using our old traditional philosophies of evidence will lead to understanding, will lead to policy change. But that's not going to happen fast enough, right? So in some ways, I think we are catching up. I think the hesitancy of confronting this, students across the US want universities to divest from petroleum products, from their university funds, from their endowments. Those are the types of investments that those endowments are in. They said, no coal and gas. And that's a public movement. So it's not a board movement, it's the exact opposite. That's young people moving out and saying, no, we want green investments. And I think these are the type of levers which are, I don't know how effective they are, but are really important as well.
Excellent. I want to then talk about the tangible steps. So I can see that there's a lot of excitement for taking this action from the cheers in the room. But for people who are going, I want this to be part of my toolbox, we're talking about things that people are familiar with, research and having conversations with people and understanding power. I'm really keen to hear from each of you, and I'm going to start with you, Ella, on what are the first steps that people can take if they want to work more in this space and have this type of influence in their toolbox?
Great question. I'm not sure I have the answer. But I think doing great research is really important, providing, evidence-based data, particularly for investors and, financial actors, is really important. Rankings are amazing because they assign that research to a company, which is what we're investing in. So if we can see that a company's, doing bad over here versus all these other companies who are doing well, then that's something that, if you are invested in that company, you can take to them and say, like, hey, why are you, underperforming compared to your peers? So I think good research and data is really important. I think changing public sentiment, changing what customers care about, like investors ultimately care about, what their customers care about, and they will listen to that. So if you can shift, what customers care about, then eventually investors will listen. I mean, I know one recent survey that came out, the Responsible Investment Association of Australasia, they do surveys on what consumers want as part of their investment offerings, and the number one issue they care about is animal welfare, actually, which is quite interesting. So, responsible investors are going to be having to focus more on animal welfare because that's what customers are wanting them to focus on. So, yeah, I think those two things are really important. And then just advocacy, as I said, pushing for better government regulation. We've seen Australia being pretty slow to implement even things like mandatory reporting on climate for companies. So, health is probably quite a long way off, unfortunately, in Australia. So really, agitating for that regulatory change is really important as well for, pushing investors to consider these issues.
Excellent. So research, scorecards, advocacy, we can do these things. Tay?
So one sentence that you said that struck with me is, what do consumers want? And I think that's where we're all aligned, whether it's government, industry, or in the advocacy sector. And what is the narrative around how people choose, right, healthier products and so on? I think citizens, when we go to them with, here's the risk, right, and so on, I think cognitively people understand that. But in terms of at the point of making the decision, especially for the young people here, okay, maybe I should not stigmatize any group, but when you're at the supermarket aisle and so on, I think it often still boils down to my favorite snack, right, or my favorite processed food and so on. I think the overall literacy around the health impact of how you make your choices and in the long term, I think there's a missing narrative in there because, especially for the young people, the risk horizon is very long, right? YOLO, I want to enjoy my food, and okay, CBD, maybe when I'm 40s and so on. So I should enjoy today. So how do we bring that salience into the young people's minds? just as they did for environmental sustainability. I think that one was a bit different because everybody is starting to feel the impact of climate change, right? You could see the weather pattern shift and so on. But on health, I think we have a challenge in that is cognitive understanding enough to drive change in consumer behavior, or are there new ways of kind of spurring that to the extent that then consumers start to become a lot more vocal in terms of what gets sold and then what they are consuming, right? I think there's a missing narrative in there that it might be quite. I'm trying to figure out what that narrative is, apart from the health risks and so on. But I think if we are able to unlock that, then I think the consumer voice will become a lot louder, and they will be a lot more proactive in wanting to see change.
So understanding what people want to see, but also there's an education piece here, because it's not, as we all know, it's not as simple as choice. Adnan.
If you could all register for my course this semester, I'll be the most well-enrolled course. I'm joking.
I actually really want to come.
I'm going to offer a couple of perspectives here, because I think first, not everybody needs to do everything. So understand if you are okay being an ally of action, then you remain on the side and support the action, or like Tay, you're going to be right in the middle of the action, right? And not everybody needs to be in the middle of the action, but it's important for you to distinguish that because there are repercussions. I'm about to launch a Lancet Commission on Global Gun Violence, and the gun industry has been known to come after academics. I am fully prepared for them to do that, but with the commission together, we will work to expose what the gun industry has done, even during COVID, to sell guns. That's another commercial determinant of health. So it's important for each one of us to have that risk-benefit analysis and then decide. Second, I do agree with all of the previous contributions, and I very much appreciate the role of the demand side. This relationship between demand and supply side interventions are very, very important. But I want to introduce the notion of those who cannot control either side, those who have no choice. So I spent 20 years at Johns Hopkins University in East Baltimore, and there was no grocery store in East Baltimore, essentially. There were only mom and pop stores, and the only thing they sold were chips and Coke. So what did the young people have? Chips and Coke. So the autonomy of choice has to be granted because there's a systemic problem here. So the lovely situation in Singapore is something we idealize. But large stretches of the country that I come from, and then you can expand that to low and middle income countries, etc. In fact, when I worked in Bangladesh, I could easily drink a Coke, but was very scared of drinking the water, even in the villages. And I worked, for those of you who know, in Matlab to study drowning. And that's, I think, the fundamental issue here as well, is a disconnect, which is I think it's time for us to realize that there is no equal context. And that inequality, which we've talked about in this conference, is important even in this sphere. And I think it's incredibly important in relationship to commercial determinants. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, that's that whole point around if there are more walking paths, people will walk more. If they're not there, it's not possible. Catherine, I would like to leave the final possible gems or tips to you. If you could share some suggestions to people who want to jump into this space.
So there just isn't a silver bullet in this space. That's the first thing I want to say. And I think one of the things that's like magical and enjoyable about working in the space is just how many different actors. I was just thinking we need academics, we certainly need really feisty civil society organizations, we need, brave and informed regulators and legislators. We actually need allies on the inside of companies. I was just this week, I got an email from a woman who works for one of the really, really large insurance companies. I won't name the company. She's been head of sustainability. She's been at the firm for 34 years as head of sustainability, and they've just made her role redundant, which is really sad. And so she's leaving, and she's just so full of knowledge and commitment. And so she can be enlisted in the movement. So we just need a multitude of actors, all of whom can bring something really important to the story. And then we have like tools and tactics, some of, many of which have been talked about. We need amazing research, we need advocacy, communications. We absolutely need to elevate the voices of people with lived experience to kind of come into new spaces. And some of the work I'm most proud of is training people in the art of speaking at a company's annual general meeting, bringing their stories, maybe people with disabilities or people in really low-paid employment. And sometimes those are just so magical, those kind of moments of advocacy in unusual spaces. And then for this particular work that we're doing, you also really need to understand corporate law and be able to use tools and tactics that are kind of a bit unfamiliar in public health world or even in civil society. So like learning the tools and tricks so that we can be powerful in places we haven't been. But it is all of the above. And I also have to say that it's also organizations that can fund this kind of work. That's a massively crucial contribution. So I'm sorry to have given such a blobby answer. The fact is, it's just a lot of different things that create the ingredients for success. But we have to do this. And I'm so happy this session was part of the World Health Summit Regional Conference. It's kind of a sign of the times and very encouraging.
It's very exciting, and I don't think anyone here thinks it was a blobby answer. We want to go to you for questions, and I want to pass to Bonnie to ask those questions. So while Bonnie comes over, for the next 15 minutes, we're really keen to hear from you. And also in the next break, we're going to create a little campaign group here, because I just think about, imagine what we could do together. So over to you. Bonnie.
Thanks, Katerina. So we've got some roving mics around the room. So please pop your hand up. We've got one at the back there. And it'd be great if you could say your name and where you're from as well. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Yongi. I'm from Monash University. My family's from Malaysia, and for me, a plate of char kway teow is like a warm hug, or Hainanese chicken rice. I just wanted to I'm curious to know how much, particularly when trying to change food, you'll have a low sodium diet. You're also intersecting with culture and the things that you've grown up eating. And particularly, I know in Asian food, soy sauce, fish sauce is very prevalent. I'd just be curious to hear, has that sort of factored in how you approach things, and particularly in strategically thinking through, should we go supply side, demand side, in trying to make those changes?
Yeah, go ahead, Tay.
Yeah, thanks very much. When we launch our campaigns and so on, we're very mindful not to have it construed as an attack on our food culture, right? So for Singapore and Malaysia, I think that's a very touchy issue. So that's where homework is very important, right? What we have done when we looked at the levels of sodium in our food items, we saw that it has gone up by 22% over the period of about 12 years. Right. So there was a period in time where our food had lower sodium, right, for the same item, and we were still a food haven, right? And then therefore the starting point is then to get the industry to, why not just use less salt, right? Because our food items have so much herbs and spices and so on, right? Southeast Asian cuisine. There's really no need to drench the food items in salt. And in fact, today, if we ask people, they find that our food is way too salty. By the way, Australian food is also very salty. But yours is different, right? It's processed food. So maybe it's like cheeses and stuff like that. Meat patties. So our encouragement to F&B is, why not just roll back our level of added salt to 2010 levels, right? Which is where we were. And then if you want to go further, then use the salt substitutes and so on. And in that way, it's kind of preserving our cultural heritage. In fact, it's enhancing it, going back to when flavors were at the forefront rather than the taste of salt.
Thanks, Tay. I see, Jen, you've got your hand up the very back.
Thanks. I'm Jen from the University of Melbourne. Your point, Adnan, around naming and shaming, I'm curious if anyone in the space has considered tax evasion. as something that should be considered. It defunds the public sector, which is bad for public health. And whether then, to the point of awkward conversations, if that means we need to be having awkward conversations about Microsoft, Bloomberg, the Gates Foundation, because it's all tax evasion. Thanks.
Who'd like to take that question on?
Well, I think it's really important. I think it should become part of the conversation. I think you're spot on. If tax evasion strategies are used to then have funding that promotes public health, that might be an issue. There might be a problem. There's also traditionally a critique now of many of the foundations you just named, that their sources, if you historically trace them, could involve fuel, coal, even tobacco. And that is on the books. It's transparently. It's been tracked. I think these are important conversations to have, and I'm not sure any one of us specifically have had them, but I do think it's important. Could I steal a 30-second response to my friend before, the food guy? But just to say, I wanted to generalize something you said. Because practices exist in cultures for centuries does not mean that they are all pro-health. There are many cultural practices that exist. Some of them turn out to be disastrous for health. Extreme example, female genital mutilation. Others don't, right? And so there is, ethical relativism says that it's really important to be respectful. But at the end, if there is high preponderance of evidence that it is harmful to health, then the engagement, the relationship, the co-partnering, and the co-dialogue in order to get to a level where that harmful component is removed, while the cultural practice can dominate, is important. So I just want to make a point that just because something exists for centuries doesn't mean it's good, per se. Thank you.
Thanks, Adnan. Okay, we've got a question at the front here. Go ahead.
Yes. So, hi, my name is Wenbo Song. I'm a John PhD student for global health at the London School of Hygiene Tropical Medicine in UK and Nagasaki University in Japan. But my research focuses on Asia-Pacific regional health. And I was hoping to ask a question about so-called the global market shift strategy that many international companies are actually using to avoid, to probably undermine what everyone have been doing, but in a global perspective, still trying to reframe the question, but try to expand. So what they do is that if you look at the everyone come from, you always come from the high-income country, but that also means you all come from the country where you have just a relatively smaller population in this whole world. So those global companies, what they often do is they create very nice picture in high-income country, but because they're also responsible for their investors. They need to think about the money and think about their stock. So they do the good things in high-income country, but then they explore. They start to explore the commercial risk factors in low and middle-income countries. For example, tobacco. Now they shift from the high-income countries to Thailand to Indonesia, and more horribly, even if the interventions that they later on be implemented to Thailand and Indonesia, the new product from those commercial companies will come along vamping, and so that comes like a circle. This company keep doing making the good money, but just literally shift the risk from high income countries to low and middle income countries, and which further extend the gap of the people's health between high-income countries and low and middle-income countries. So I was thinking, yes, a very open question, but any awareness or thoughts on this kind of the market shift strategy that those international companies are actually using to, on the one hand, create a big picture for themselves, but actually shift the risk factors to other countries. Yes.
Thank you. Is there someone who'd like to take that one on in particular?
Maybe I'll respond from the perspective of International Network of Health Promoting Foundations, which Dr. Sandro was the immediate past chair, and I just took over. Actually, governments around the world were all looking at who has some of these regulatory practices or standards and so on, and we're all trying to then share the best practices and implement it within the respective countries. So that's from a government viewpoint. So, for example, on sugar standards, right? I think, at least for Brunei and Thailand, we have sort of aligned our threshold for sugar, right, which is about 5-6% to qualify as healthy. Right? I think Malaysia is somewhere in the same ballpark. So I think that's the power of platforms like this, international platforms where various agencies can come together, share what are some of the knowledge, best practices, and so on, and then hopefully being able to implement it in the respective countries. Right? So we're also having deep in conversation about the issue of vaping, which is, I think that will be the primary and defining health issue that we need to have very concrete measures to resolve at the international as well as regional levels.
Catherine, I see you've got another comment.
Well, just to, I mean, the issue you identify is absolutely a problem and a huge challenge. I guess one of the things in support of these investor advocacy strategies into companies is that investors also operate in the high-income countries and can have a lot of influence on companies that are having a problem impact in the global south. But one of the things we're trying to do is bring people from, let's say, Latin America to London to speak in person at the annual general meetings of companies. And I think we can use Zoom and video to bring those voices closer, but it's a major challenge. I'm not saying we've resolved it at all, but I don't think we should feel utterly defeated. I think there are a lot of the things that we've talked about today can be brought to bear on the challenge you identify.
Thanks, Catherine. Okay, so we've run out of time. I'm sorry for those with questions, but I'm now going to hand over to Michelle to share some reflections and to close us out.
Thank you, Bonnie. Now, okay. So I'd also like to echo the thank you that Bonnie just said, and what a fabulous panel, amazing information that you've shared with us all today, but also to thank the audience as well for being part of it. And so I've been tasked with coming up with 3 reflections. And there was so much information, but I just want to say the use of people power to put pressure on corporate power through the use of many tools that you heard about. There were many tools shared, from advocacy, scorecards, research, shareholder rights, and holding companies to account because they're acting on our behalf. Also, activate your super, make it work for you and your health. Every time you intersect with the commercial sector, check the conflicts of interest or the alignment to your own interests and leverage the common interests. And keep in mind, investment sector have differing priorities. So I just want to take a line out of the book of Dr. Adnan and do a bit of a plug. So if you're really interested in this conversation on commercial determinants of health, there is an event that is coming up in November, the Public Health Australian Association, so if you want to check that out. And also tomorrow there is a session on misinformationitis, the impact of tech on health, so check that out as well. So with that, I would just like to do a round of applause and thank you all very much.